In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
My name's Chris Smaje. We're here in Vallis Veg in Somerset, where we run a small farm, small holding, 18 acres. I guess the main thing we do is grow vegetables, little market garden that we sell vegetables locally and all sorts of other things going on the site. And we've been doing that for over 10 years now. In my background, in an earlier life, I was a social scientist, university-based social scientist. I mean, I guess the process has been feeling like food and farming was a really sort of key issue that we needed to get right, or more right than we have sort of historically in recent times. So getting involved in the kind of practical farming side of it, and then the experience of that making me think, well, you know, somehow we need to make it easier for small scale, more ecological farms to proliferate and prosper in the world. And that sort of took me back a little bit to the writing and the thinking and the social science, and also the sort of agronomy and the biological science, the ecology of farming. So I'm trying to make the case in different ways for the need for a small farm future, as in the title of the book. The first part of the book has a section called 10 Crises, and I'll probably embarrass myself by forgetting what they all are now. But yeah, I mean, you know, clearly climate change is really critical, and that is going to scramble a lot of the things that we've taken for granted. Energy is obviously critical as well, that's connected. I mean, so much of the way that we operate in agriculture and in everything else is based on fossil fuels, and although, you know, we have other low carbon sources of energy coming through, really we're still using more and more fossil fuels globally year on year. You know, we're not really in the stage of an energy transition, so that's a huge issue. Obviously ecological issues, soils, water, biodiversity, and then obviously social issues as well, about, you know, the way that the economy operates, the various political crises that are bubbling up, you know, partly in response to all of these things, the level of inequality in the world. So, you know, you put all those things together, you know, you can sort of think of business as usual type solutions maybe for some of those things, but you put them all together in a sort of interactive way, and I think we're looking at, you know, some very different ways in which the world is going to be operating soon. And I don't think there's any, you know, there isn't any, I'm not arguing that, you know, there's just some simple off the peg solution. You know, if everyone farms like we do here, then, you know, the world's gonna be fine. I think the problems we have are quite intractable, but I think if we start working towards more integration with our local ecological bases and building more local economic autonomies than we've been accustomed to in the modern world system, you know, that's a good place to start. I try and avoid too many hard and fast definitions in the book, and a small farm, in my opinion, can be anything from somebody living in a high-rise block in a city growing some herbs on their windowsill, through to, you know, thousands of acres of a mountainside. It's really the way that it's integrated into an economy and tries to build that sort of local economic autonomy into its practice. So part of it, I think, is about decommodification. It's kind of an economy of growers and eaters rather than producers and consumers. I mean, I'm not arguing that there would be no markets or no money transfers, but it's, I think, you know, self-reliance at some level at the individual or the farm or the community level is really key. So it's moving away from the idea of a sort of cash crop that's going to maximize income, and thinking about the farm as a kind of long-term entity, as a sort of patrimony. There's a lot of interesting analysis of, you know, so-called family farming or peasant farming, where you're not trying to maximize income, you're trying to juggle a whole set of balances between work and leisure, the longevity of the farm, you know, returns to labour and so on. So it's a whole different way of thinking about the farm as a sort of living entity that's integrated, within the ongoing ecological base, but also the local human ecology. What's different about the small farm? I suppose one dimension of it that I try and get into is thinking about it in terms of intensification. When we think about that, generally, historically, we think about mechanisation, sort of high yielding crop varieties, and also expansion of farmland, the whole essentially quite tragic history of European expansion into the Americas and turning prairies and forests into farmland. So the small farm approach is much more about sort of living in place. The world that we're facing, there's going to be a lot of people moving, so it's not necessarily about having deep roots in a particular place, but it's about kind of making the ecology of place sort of work sustainably. So it's quite labour intensive potentially, and that's a whole argument, in terms of, is it too much labour on the farm? Is it back-breaking work and so on? So, I think part of the problem is, you look at a lot of peasant societies historically, and it was a pretty grim struggle, but you have to look at why it was grim, who was kind of bearing down on the peasant farmers. There's a famous quotation from the historian Richard Tawney about the condition of the peasantry in China being like a man who's up to his neck in water, so a little ripple will drown him. But the issue there is that there's a huge global capitalist economy kind of sitting on top of his head, sort of pushing him down. So we have to address that. I mean, and again, I think we get into these very dualistic ways of thinking that either you have to have this sort of very diesel intensive, huge, combine harvester type of farming, or you're out with your sort of digging stick in the field. That's a vastly overdrawn duality. There's all sorts of intermediate potentials. And although we live in a very energy intensive society, energy use on the farm as a proportion of total society energy use is not that high. So if we can relocalize the economy, some people get very into all these kind of high-tech futurology about sort of robots on the farm and so on, and I think that's kind of missing the point in a way. What we really need in the future, that there's going to be a lot of people in need of low carbon employment. I think we've got to decarbonize, we've got to reduce the amount of fossil energy, we've got to reduce the amount of capital intensive jobs. So there's a need for low carbon labour intensive sectors, and farming is going to be a key one. Obviously, if we can use technologies and methods that that sort of make it a little bit easier for the farmer, so much the better. But I think we need to get away from this sort of notion that farm intensification is all about crop yields and sort of machine-based intensification. We need to get into thinking about the sort of labour returns on the farm. The sort of whole debate about soil is quite complex. I mean, it's bafflingly complex actually, and also soil carbon sequestration is another whole issue that I go into a bit in the book, but it's a bit of a minefield. I mean, undoubtedly there is soil loss. The basic sort of model of agriculture is producing cereal grains, which are annual crops that have to be, the traditional way of doing it is ploughing, harrowing, establishing the crop, harvesting, and the sort of mechanical damage to the soil and the weathering damage. It does tend to sort of physically blow the soil away, or the nutrients are leached out of it and we're replacing them using fossil fuel intensive methods. So, I mean, that has to change. What I sort of avoid in the book is lighting on one particular farming method and saying, this is the answer. I mean, I think the reality is that every farm, every farmer, every local microclimate is different. I mean, generally, I think we need to be much more careful about tillage, particularly in arid and tropical climates. We need to think more about cover cropping, about sort of crop diversity, but there aren't any kind of single answers really. And some of the stuff about soil loss sometimes I think is a little bit exaggerated, but Overall, I mean, soil forms very, very slowly. You know, it's a geological process, and human farming, you know, kind of steams in and you know, this sort of riotous production of crops. So I don't know if it's true that we've only got 60 or 70 years left, but there is a question, I think, as to whether farming in general, and certainly the way that we farm now, is going to be sustainable, you know, over the long haul of human evolution. I mean, we've only been doing it in this way for 10,000 years, you know, it's nothing, you know. So I think there's a great book just came out recently, Farming for the Long Haul by Michael Foley. So, you know, we need to start thinking in those much more kind of civilizational terms, I think. Do we need mass production of food to feed the world? Can small-scale farming feed the world? We've become very, very reliant on just three crops, wheat, rice and maize, that all cereals, all from the grass family, and which lend themselves to mass production and to mechanisation and easy transport. And certainly not arguing that we shouldn't grow those crops at all, but they can be grown on a small scale. And, you know, really we need much more diversity of cropping, and there's all sorts of good techniques that you can use on a small scale that you can't really use on a big scale because it's too fiddly or too labor intensive. So again, we get back to this issue of labor. So, you know, often people say, well, we can't feed the world using various alternative agricultural techniques. You know, organic farming is the one that people probably are most aware of. But that tends to be based on the assumption of having a really small proportion of the population farming, and that's not an assumption that I think we need to make. I think we can have more people involved in farming. I've done a little exercise in my book where I project whether Britain could feed itself probably in 20 or 30 years' time with a much bigger population swollen by climate change, refugees, and using sustainable alternative methods. And I deliberately made very conservative assumptions so as not to, you know, overestimate and come up with the, you know, the answer that I wanted. And the reality is, yeah, you know, the problem is not actually the productivity of the land. You know, it can be made very, very productive in quite sustainable ways. You know, the issue is labour. You need people to do it. But, you know, with 15% of the population, you know, that I think is the sort of debate that we need to be having. And of course, it doesn't really fit in with the present mode of economic thinking. But as I said earlier, you know, that is going to change. It is inevitably going to change in the years to come with the sorts of energy and capital crises that we're going to, and climate crises that we're going to encounter. So it can feed the world, and I think it can do it better and more sustainably and in a more socially congenial way if we build those local autonomies that I was talking about. The sorts of policies that we need in order for a small farm future to happen, land access is a really critical one. We sort of get into this notion that property is theft, which it kind of is in the way that modern capitalist societies work. Wealth tends to get concentrated in a few hands, so we really need to unlock that and make it possible for ordinary people to get hold of sufficient land to farm well and to be able to sell the produce from the land and make a living from it, which is very difficult to do, not only for small-scale so-called alternative farmers, but even mainstream large-scale farmers now can't really do that. And we've got this whole sort of global race to the bottom where big mechanised farmers are sort of competing the price of their products down and then pushing poorer people off the land in poorer countries. So, I mean, there's all sorts of economic instruments available, planning policies, inheritance, estate taxes, land value tax, which a lot of people are quite into. I'm not so persuaded about, but I go through some of these things in the book. It's not a detailed technical analysis. I mean, the main problem is not coming up with economic policies that will make it possible, because they're quite simple to devise. The main problem is the sort of entrenched power that prevents those policies from being implemented. But then, of course, we're in this kind of interesting period both in Britain and globally where a lot of the political certainties are beginning to unravel. You know, we've got Brexit going on here, or the so-called populist politics around the world, and I talk about that a bit in the book, the populist moment. And that's interesting because when we talk about populism today, we tend to, think about the Brexit Party in Britain or Donald Trump, but there's a long history of agrarian populism from countries, a politics of the people at a time when most ordinary people were farmers. So there's a whole interesting history of agricultural populism to draw on, which was essentially trying to make it possible for small farmers to prosper and to have, a society that was geared to small-scale farming. So I talk a fair bit about that in the book. So as I say, the policies are essentially about keeping farmland affordable and available and circulating. The policies aren't the problem, it's the kind of power politics that is the problem, and that's interesting because it's all beginning to unravel at the minute. It's an interaction of economic with political power. In the book I talk about what I call a global capitalist political economy, which doesn't really trip off the tongue, but it's important. I think, we talk about the economy as if it's this kind of separate, independent thing with a life of its own, but the early economic thinkers were more perceptive in realizing that they called it political economy, and they realized that the politics and the economics were connected. The way it essentially works is investors put up money and they expect a bigger return on their investment. And in most societies historically, that's been regarded as okay. That's not a bad thing to have creditors and merchants, people that can oil the wheels of the economy and put money up. But the political systems tend to keep them in check. What we've had in the modern world is essentially letting that investment cycle dominate, and then you sort of get a vicious circle of investment calling forth a return and making that the dominant economic and political base of the society. And that then sort of corrupts the political process because governments now are sort of in hock to the dictates of footloose global capital. There's counter arguments, it's complex, but that is essentially the problem. We've made return on investment the kind of main principle by which we allocate social benefit, and it doesn't really work ultimately because money begets money. And you see that the huge increase in returns to capital of the already rich countries at the expense of poor countries, and the material trace of that is more and more energy use, more and more greenhouse gas emissions. So all of those things are interconnected, and we need to get out of that kind of exponential return on investment model. I am advocating for decentralisation. I think I guess what I try and get into in the book is that I don't think that's not gonna happen top down. The American Senate or the British Parliament are not gonna willingly decentralise, but I think it's gonna happen by default because of the problems that we have with climate change, fossil fuel dependence, and with capital collapse. Basically, in order to sort of keep that cycle of economic growth that I was talking about, you sort of get an exponential function where in 20 years' time, we're going to have to create as much new economic production. In the 2040s, we're going to have, in that decade, we're going to have to add economic output, which is double the size of the entire global economy in 1970. That's not going to happen, so we're going to get capital collapse. And I think the way that's going to work is, we're still going to have the sort of powerful, dominant centres in the world, Western Europe, the USA, China, so on and so on. But I think they're going to have less and less ability to sort of control what's going on around their peripheries. And that's, it's a dangerous time. I'm not saying that it's, in many ways it's not a good thing. I think there's potentially a lot of quite nasty outcomes that can arise out of that. But I think that is the opportunity where people will start building these local economic autonomies that I mentioned. And we've been sort of talking informally while you've been here about examples like Preston. Here in Frome, we've got an independent town council that's done all sorts of good local things to boost the local economy. There's lots of examples around the world of people who, essentially are not getting they're not getting very much from the political centre, and I think that's going to become more and more apparent. The centre is going to be trying to draw more to itself and give less back, and there comes a point when people start to essentially by default have to start building those autonomies. So I think that's the way it's going to happen, but I'm not at all suggesting it's going to be a straightforward or a benign process. I think really what I'm trying to do in the book is say, look, there's some bad stuff coming down the line, but this is the best way I can think of trying to take that opportunity and turn it into something positive. The thing that I really think we need to do is try and build those local autonomies, local economic autonomies, and particularly sort of food and farming autonomies. There are things that we can do that fall under the sort of rubric of green consumerism. We can try and avoid buying products that are environmentally damaging and buy things that are better. But I think ultimately that's not, we need to sort of break out of that whole model, so that's where getting the local food and farm production systems more geared to these local autonomies is a good thing to do. And that's where, there's things that you can do as an individual, but you start having to move the debate politically. So, that's a key thing for people to get involved in. And there's lots of things people can do to try and make that happen, but, there is inertia in the political process. But I suppose that there can be sort of clever ways of trying to work your way around that. So, here, for example, the government built in some provision for people to register to self-build houses, and if there are ways that we can sort of build on that to sort of create local small holdings and pressurize local authorities to release bits of land. I'm not a very good politician myself, but if people have those skills to network, connect, and just start thinking about, it's as if the sort of global capitalist political economy has kind of snipped apart all of the sort of network of interconnections that we need locally in order to have these autonomies. So it's any bit of thread that you can find to just re-stitch that locally, and the possibilities are endless. It's sort of down to people's creativity really, but that's what we need to be doing, I think. You have big farms that are incredibly leveraged. They've got huge amounts of equipment. They're producing a lot, but they're very sort of leveraged, and obviously the financial system sort of favours them in some ways. But so with a small farm, you probably do have to go in a different way. What you can't really do is sort of spend huge amounts of money on capital, sort of or sort of input investment, and then expect to make a huge amount of money. You have to sort of find a way of having a sort of low input, low output system. And of course, it so much depends on sort of issues like access to land, access to markets, and so on. So you have to be inventive. And I think you also have to have an eye on the short term and the long term. I mean, what most small scale growers do is concentrate on high value crops, salad leaves and that sort of thing. And you can say, well, that's great, but it's not going to feed the world. And that's true, but that's partly because of the relative costs of those sorts of crops compared to highly mechanized, highly fossil fuel subsidized crops at the moment. And that's all going to change. So I think, once you've figured out a small farming system that works for you, in the future, you can move into other things. In a way, it's the same sorts of things with any business. If you're networked into a local community, I think it's difficult if you're just competing on a sort of open market. If you're competing with, if you're selling veg, if you're competing with the local greengrocer or the local supermarket, it's difficult. So you need to find ways to create more of a local market. You need to find ways to get some land, to sort of get access to land. But again, that's not necessarily difficult. But, you have to bear in mind that so much of the kind of so-called viability of the bigger scale stuff is all based on concentrated historic capital and sort of fossil fuel based investment. So it's not really comparing like for like. It comes back to the point I've kept making really of building autonomies. That's where it starts, sort of trying to find a way to build an autonomy from the sort of existing economic system. And I also mentioned earlier on the idea of a small farmer being someone growing herbs on a windowsill. I think we need to get out of this notion of a proper farmer being someone who drives a tractor and is selling in sort of big global markets. If you're just growing veg in your backyard, you're a farmer as far as I'm concerned, and that's a way that you're building autonomy from the global commodity economy. You're producing a bit of food for yourself. Probably you're not going to be able to produce all the food that you need, but again, you're just chipping away at that autonomy building. But yeah, it is possible for people to make a modest living as a commercial farmer, and that's really what we should be doing. We should be making modest livings in the world now, and not immodest livings. So yeah, they can be viable. And also, it's partly about the sort of life that you lead. You're producing food for yourself, you're living a low impact life on the land. You don't necessarily need that much. So, there's all those different levels of consideration. If you've got secure access to land, you're the one that's making those judgments and drawing those balances. Do I want to do this? Well, I don't have to earn, that extra bit of income. I can do this instead. I can, develop another project or sit in my hammock or whatever. I mean, I don't mean to make it seem like the life of a farmer is particularly an easy one, but it's not necessarily harder than many of the other jobs. And I've noticed that in recent time, there's a lot of young, well-educated people getting interested in farming, I think for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is that the mainstream job market is increasingly unpleasant and competitive and hard-working, and for what what is it all about ultimately? Whereas people kind of see the benefit of producing a livelihood from the land and producing good sustainably grown fruit and veg and other crops for people. So I think there are some gains to be made, definitely. The book that I'm writing is called A Small Farm Future. It's going to be published by Chelsea Green. It will be of interest, I think, to people who are working in farming, in the food sector, in alternative economic activism, and sort of putting that into a broader historical and ecological and economic context. Hopefully it will be of interest to general readers. You sort of get this argument that the only way we can solve our modern problems is these very high-tech interventions and, GM crops and mirrors in space to protect us from climate change and so on. So I'm trying to put a sort of well-grounded alternative argument that's not the way forward. So, I'm hoping it will just sort of be of general interest. I can't help being an ex-academic, so I'm hoping that it might be of interest to academics and students, but it's not an academic book as such. I mean, I hope it will be of interest to other people. I suppose I kind of wrote it for myself to try and make sense of the world as I see it, getting into farming, trying to make it work, which we kind of have, but facing so many obstacles along the way and sort of thinking, why does this have to be so hard, and are there ways of organising the world in a different way that that could actually make this a more congenial small farm future for for everybody in the world? Because I think the way that, as we were saying earlier, the sort of way that the world is working presently is not sustainable in the long run. So really it's sort of trying to think through what the obstacles to bringing that world into being are and how to overcome them. So to some extent it's been my personal struggle, but I think it will be of interest. I've written a blog for quite a number of years now, also called Small Farm Future, that has generated quite a lot of interest and sort of interesting people commenting on it. So in many ways the book emerged out of the blog and is just sort of trying to continue and deepen some of the discussions that have gone on the blog. And my sense from that is that there are a lot of people out there looking for alternatives. And I'm not saying that I've got all the answers in the book, but hopefully I've clarified some of the issues and provided some interesting pointers to the future.